Watch your step, please, if you. Sorry, thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Wonderful questions and discussion.
Again, thanks very much. Next up in our symposium, we're going to hear from some truly inspirational young voices, young humanitarians working at the cutting edge of understanding the demands and prospects of the refugee crisis and related problems. And I wouldn't want to suggest that the people we've just heard from are not young, but you know what I mean. I guarantee in the next few minutes you're going to hear some perspectives that you may not have considered before. First, let me introduce Raj Kumar, who is the founding director of something called Devex. How many of you, I'm going to admit my ignorance here, how many of you, before you read it in the program today, had heard of Devex? All right, you're all engaged. That's great. Glad to hear it. It is a media platform that connects people who work in development, including a database of 700,000 development professionals and 12,000 companies. To me, it sounds like sort of the LinkedIn of this community. And perhaps more database-oriented than that. Raj started Devex at the beginning of the social media revolution in 2000 when he was a grad student at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Mr. Kumar will interview Ms. Hadeel Ibrahim, who is the founding executive director of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation on Governance and Leadership in Africa, named for her businessman father who earned his fortune selling mobile phone services in Africa. He launched the foundation 10 years ago when Hadeel was in her early 20s. I'm revealing probably there. She's also on the board of the Mary Robinson Foundation and co-chairs the board of the Africa Center here in New York. She previously served as a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on humanitarian financing and on the board of Refugees International. So Raj, if you would, and Hadeel, if you would please come forward and take your seats, that would be great. Let's welcome them. Okay, good.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Great to be with all of you this morning. Hadeel, welcome. In fact, Peter this morning said to me, can you make this a provocative conversation? I said, this is with Hadeel Ibrahim. This is not going to be hard. So we are ready to speak the truth. I don't know if I count speaking of truth in that young category, but I'm going to take it, Ralph. You were part, among the many things you've done, Hadeel, you were part of this panel that published a report called Too Important to Fail. Yeah. And the kind of subtext underneath that title is that we are failing, that there is something wrong with the system that we've got, that the humanitarian system was designed for a different era. We're now in a new one. We've been kind of very optimistic today, getting uplifted. Let's get depressed for a second.
Okay.
We'll come back around, I promise. What's going wrong?
Well, so to backtrack a little bit and speak about the panel was really constituted in quite an unusual way for a UN panel because we were brought in as independent experts. So maybe with the exception of our co-chair, Kristalina Georgieva, most of us had worked in the development community, leaders of business, but weren't necessarily humanitarian experts. So I speak with due humility in front of the assembly. And I think we were invited to bring a different perspective to looking at the challenges of humanitarian financing, and of course that involved us taking a systems-wide view. And I think one of the things that we started off being slightly astonished by was how bad the data was. Because we were really trying to rapidly absorb the scale and magnitude of the challenge we were being faced with, and when we interrogated the data, it seemed in many cases to be very difficult to substantiate these figures. So people talked, and I'm using 2014 data because we served in 2015, people were talking about $25 billion, they were talking about a financing gap, and we said, well, what's the delta? How are you generating the need number? And they'd say, well, it's appeals. We said, okay, what's the confidence in the data on appeals? Well, it's what agencies ask for, but we think some of the agencies ask too much because they're not going to get it. It was kind of extraordinary.
It is.
The lack of quality data.
And the numbers are suspiciously round.
They're suspiciously round, exactly. And having come from a data background where I had overseen the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, which was like 100,000 data points on African government performance, a space where you'd think that data would be weak, right? What are African governments doing in providing public goods and services? I was astonished to move into a space where the data was weaker, even though we were dealing with a much bigger, better funded, apparently more transparent and accountable international system. So that was the first place, really trying to get our heads around what was happening. So that was a challenge. Some of the other small challenges, I remember sitting with some senior actors within the UN humanitarian system and saying, what's the biggest challenge you face? And I was waiting to hear about barrel bombs or the Security Council, and they said the development community. The biggest, it was astonishing. People perceived that the biggest challenge that they faced as a humanitarian community was the development community. So I think that humanitarian development divide that gets alluded to so often, there is a real issue there that needed to be confronted. So there were, I would say data is one issue. Having briefly alluded to the Security Council, we perhaps don't need a long conversation on UN reform, or perhaps we do. But I think one of the challenges that we kept coming back to was where you have a peace and security architecture that's failing in its mandate, it's failing to provide peace and security globally, and you have a humanitarian ecosystem that's having to carry the can, so to speak, you cannot resolve the latter without at least alluding to the former. And so one of the questions that in honesty, I don't think we genuinely adequately resolved as a panel. I think as a humanitarian financing panel, it was just, we couldn't quite get our mandate far enough.
More about the money.
It was more about the money, but it begged the question, if we are unable to have a robust peace and security architecture that can deliver on a situation like Syria, then we're going to have a financing problem. And we can't continue to delink the two in the kind of broader discourse. And maybe I would throw out to this room, to what extent are the humanitarian actors who are out there doing the work on the front line able to coalesce and address some of these really hard political issues? Because, I mean, well, you don't need me to go further.
Yeah. And Nazanin said some of this, right? And this is going to be the third time there's a humanitarian response in Mosul. These things feed off of each other. And of course, Mary Robinson mentioned this morning that it's not even just about security, but there's also the climate, the growing number of displaced people from climate. So what we know we've got this historic number of displaced people. We know there's 125 million people in the world today relying on humanitarian aid. And the system designed for that, as you discovered and directly state in that report, is really designed for a different time. We didn't have that kind of scale of problems. So what are some of the things that you, and I know people in this room are familiar with that report, it's actually had a pretty big reverberation throughout the UN system and I think throughout the world. What are some of the things that you came out and sort of said, these are practical, tangible things we can change to try to address a failing system?
Right, so not to repeat, I think the last panel covered a lot of this very elegantly. I would start by talking about the localization issue. So for me, the big finding from the report was that 0.2% of that $25 billion budget goes to local NGOs. I found that shocking. Borderline offensive. The notion that we can go into Syria and without funding local actors fix Syria is insanity. It's everything that the international development community and more broadly my background has done wrong for the last 50 years. It's why there still is a development community, because we fundamentally don't understand that people have to be empowered to solve their own problems. I do not know how to fix Syria. Syrians know how to fix Syria. And we can talk about prevention, we can talk about resilience, and until we are able to invest in building local civil society capacity, all of those things are abstract. So when we went to spend time on the Syrian-Turkish border just under a year ago, we met with an extraordinary range of actors. I have to say one of the fascinating things about serving on the panel was, sort of being given very broad access to both UN and non-UN and private sector actors. And we sat with local Syrian NGOs who talked about their inability to receive funding from the sort of broader global funding pot because they didn't have a 5-year track record, because there wasn't a conflict in Syria 5 years ago. And how do you respond to people saying to you, I can't get funded because your funding system does not recognize the basic facts of our reality?
So what do you say to the people who push back on that and say, well, it's just too hard to do? It's in fact, even in the Syrian example, it's hard to track the money, to know that it's being spent effectively. You and your panel, what did you find that led you to say we can do better on this?
I think when you look at a number as low as 0.2%, there's absolutely no way you can say we can't do better. And actually, I have to add, one of the things I found very frustrating was in advocating to increase that 0.2% budget, I had a lot of international NGOs claiming that they should be eligible for that because their local subsidiaries were either about to be spun off or were manned by local staff. And I was just astonished, I have to be honest, that anyone would try and cannibalize a 0.2% budget. I think one of the big challenges that we face is that we're not trying hard enough. We also, and this is true of development and humanitarian, all of this, we have to be more honest about the fact that in business, it's okay to take a portfolio approach. People are very honest. You invest with a fund, they say, well, you win some, you lose some, but the aggregate return is high. We have confidence in the return on investment. We haven't been honest about that. There will be some leakage, there will be some misappropriation. But because we're not honest about the narrative and the challenge of working in these places sometimes, when it happens, everybody loses their mind, there's terrible headlines, and we say, so we can't do the very difficult things that we're supposed to be doing. So I think the localization issue is key, because if we think about that Syrian NGO that I was sitting with, these were formerly doctors, when Syria, let's not forget, was a middle-income country on track to achieving all the Millennium Development Goals. They were doctors. They then became frontline medical workers. As soon as that country transitions into a development phase, they will become medical development practitioners of some sort. And I hope when it becomes a middle-income country again, maybe they'll go back to being doctors, or maybe they'll be health policy, civil society actors. My point is that it's only local people that have the versatility and the interest of adapting to changing circumstances. And should a country fall down, should a fragile country fall back into conflict, it's those civil society organizations that are in the development space that will adjust back into the humanitarian space. So it's the most cost-effective, it's the most versatile, it's the most state-building investment that we can possibly make. We understand the importance of building civil society, and yet 99.8% of our dollars don't do it.
You know, the other very low statistic in that report, which is related in a way, is the percentage of humanitarian aid which goes to cash, so-called cash programming or currency, vouchers, electronic money of some kind. It's another form of getting money directly to local people, even more local. It's the actual person affected.
Absolutely.
And I think the report says something like 6% of all humanitarian aid goes to that, even though it's very often seen in many studies as the most effective or can be the most effective. What is your kind of lesson from both the localization number being so low, the cash programming number being so low? What's the reason that we're in this situation?
I think it alludes back, Raj, to something I said without repeating myself unduly. Do we think people are better able to help themselves with minimal empowerment than we're able to do things for them? Genuinely. I start from the position of a kind of humility in the development community, where I think the fact that we're all here after 60 years of the development industry means that we haven't figured out how to do it properly. That's my starting point. And generally it has been top-down and something that's done to people or for people. So I think when you take that mindset into account, of course the idea of giving people cash does not fit with how we like to help people. I think it just takes a little bit of humility, and it also takes a little bit of honesty about who we are. And I think the intention changes so much about the efficacy of the output. Am I doing it to make myself feel better, or am I doing it to make that person's life better? And we have to be honest. We have to be self-critical. You know, and I'm not innocent of this. And every time I sit with the civil society organizations I work with, the young people, I certainly in the African context, I am not a young person. I have to be very humble about that. In a continent where the average age is 19, I am middle-aged. I accept that, I embrace that. And when I sit with genuine young people and see how much smarter they are than me, that they have the answers, I hope I can be an effective conduit between them and some of the senior leaders I work with. You know, every time I'm reminded of my own limitations, every single time, and that's refreshing. And so I think we have a kind of cultural crisis in a lot of our industries where we don't accept our own humility. Do we really understand the world we're living in? Certainly when I talk to my godchildren who are in their teens, I struggle to understand how they interact with the world and how they see each other in the whole digital universe. And I say that as a 33-year-old. I'm trying to catch up. Does everyone else feel that way? Right, and yet we're determining policy. Are we being honest about our disconnection from the reality and the policy we're determining? So I think one of the things that I took out of this whole process is, where do we stand back and allow people on the ground, particularly young people, to have more agency by admitting our own shortcomings? And these are not shortcomings of integrity, these are just shortcomings of reality.
Now bring some of that self-criticism to the UN. You started to allude to it a little, and we heard Mary Robinson this morning talking about breaking down some of the walls, the silos at the UN system. What did you learn, as an outsider coming to this, about the UN humanitarian agencies, the many agencies that work in this area, many good people who work there, but
Absolutely.
What did you learn about what they're doing and what you think needs to be done?
Well, my plea for humility and self-criticism was because I found it a difficult place to find people who would criticize themselves. Because, genuinely, people doing extraordinary work, you couldn't fault that. What I found difficult is because people are under so much attack, under so much scrutiny, constantly fighting for budgets, constantly on the front line of some of the most complex situations in the world, there just wasn't that time and space for them to stand back and self-criticize. And if they did, they were scared that budgets would be cut, funding would be cut. And I think that's an unhealthy ecosystem to live in. So I was in one meeting with some people from different UN agencies, and after, I think it was a four-hour roundtable. So we did a lot of listening, at which point we said, well, what do you all think you could do better? I said, well, if those people gave us more money, we said, no, I mean, that's kind of an external, I mean, just today, what could you do better? Well, not the development community, what could you do better? And after about 10 minutes, we were actually unable to get an answer about what they could do better. And that speaks a little bit to the culture that I'm talking about. One of the things we highlighted in the report, so to get away from very abstract into the very focused, one of the things we really highlighted in the report is that we need to move from this idea of competitive inefficiency to an idea of collaborative efficiency. Mm-hmm. I think I was stunned, and particularly one of my colleagues, the vice chairman of MasterCard, was stunned by the language of donors and agencies, the kind of private sector language they were imposing onto the humanitarian space. You know, we had large donors saying, well, we need to see more competitive, we need to see more competition between UN agencies or better data so that we're better able to rank UN agencies and know who to fund and who to defund. Think about what that does within the culture of the UN when agencies are being incentivized to compete with each other for the same dollars rather than collaborate. I think that's a toxic way of going about it. That's how many, many bilateral donors see funding this space.
And it may be getting worse, given the political environment.
And I think that's right. So this idea, and I think my colleague from MasterCard, Walt, put it very well. He said, you're in a situation of market failure, right? The DAB is market failure. And you're applying free market principles. As a businessman, I don't understand. This over-obsession with the sort of professionalization of the not-for-profit space, you're starting to apply business principles where I, as a businessman, would not apply business principles because we're in a refugee camp. And I think that was really striking to me. So when we just sort of framed this seemingly revolutionary idea, maybe it's more efficient to collaborate than compete. That was one of the big things we said in the report, and it sounds so blindingly obvious here and now, but it's not how we're structuring the relationships between agencies. And I say this assuming I'm talking to a room of taxpayers, this is donor-driven. This is not agency-driven. I mean, we're part of the ecosystem driving it. It's our development ministers that are making these calls. So there is, it's easy to point fingers at the UN, but as always with the UN, it's a membership organization. Like parliaments, like any other membership, you get what you deserve. And at the moment, we kind of get the UN we deserve, because we're allowing these kinds of competitive and political forces to create dysfunctionality. And how engaged are all of us in the process of trying to leverage the pressure points we have to create some blessed functionality?
You refer to the private sector, and we heard in the previous panel that cell phone towers are going up around the world, even in some of the most difficult places. That's something your dad had a lot to do with. I wonder, what did you come away with in terms of thinking of the private sector role? I found myself, I remember being in Tacloban after the typhoon there and seeing how the UN agencies and others were managing the crisis. And I thought maybe they'll be using smartphones and looking at maps and having some way of collaborating on the needs assessments. And what I found is basically people were on email all day long and could barely peel themselves away. They weren't using the latest imaging technologies or collaboration tools. What did you learn about where the humanitarian space is today in terms of the use of tech, in terms of integrating companies like MasterCard and what they offer? What stage in the evolution are we, and where do you think this needs to go?
Well, I was surprised how willing the private sector was to be engaged. I think the problem with how we've engaged the private sector in these big intergovernmental processes before is that all the decisions are made and then people start calling around asking for money. And you have people who are on the ground, like MasterCard and various others, saying, wait, you've just said all these priorities. You haven't asked for my opinion. And now we're being called in by the Global Compact or whatever to fund it. It's a criticism you could arguably make of the SDGs as well. You know, there were many voices last year around the table saying, oh, now it's time to fund, you're calling up your private sector friends. So I think there is space for more private sector engagement. I think we have to engage them a little bit further up the pipeline rather than just expecting them to foot the bill for decisions we've made. You could argue that public-private partnerships are now just turning into private implementation of public commitments that governments have no capacity to reach. That's what it looks like in a lot of these meetings. So that was one piece. The second piece was around engaging corporations around their core business. MasterCard were engaged because they're able, through their core technology, to provide systems for cash-based assistance. Mm-hmm. They could provide tens of millions of dollars of assistance in that way that they couldn't provide if they were just asked to cut a check. Similarly, I was speaking with a very senior person at GE, and they had just made a big cash contribution around the refugee crisis. I think this was late last year. GE could have made a much bigger contribution if someone had been thoughtful enough to look at what GE actually produce and see what they could give in kind. And I say this as someone that during the height of the Darfur crisis would be called up as a governance non-grant making foundation asked to give lights to refugee camps to stop women being raped because there was no one else to do it. Right? That's an ask to make of GE. They make lights, they make industrial equipment. It's much more efficient. So I think the idea that we ask businesses to do what they do best, rather than pull them to the table and ask them to cut checks, is critical, and involving them earlier on. But there's huge goodwill and desire. I think the perception is that they don't know quite where and how to plug in. So we talked a lot about creating platforms for in-kind giving. Again, these are very, very simple mechanisms, digital mechanisms that would just streamline. You all know exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff.
You started off talking about the humanitarian community saying their biggest challenge is the development community. Do you see any progress toward these two communities coming together? We've heard a lot about that already this morning. Should we really have this divide that exists between them?
I think we probed that as a group a lot. I think we, in the end, were compelled, or certainly I can speak for myself, by the unique operating environment of the humanitarian agencies and what they needed to, what it takes to be a humanitarian actor, the protocols, all of that understood. I think the onus needs to be much more on the development community. These are long-term actors. The development budget's a lot bigger. So if you're talking about people building bridges, I think you need the development community to really, the onus to be on them rather than the frontline humanitarian respondent to be constantly thinking of how is providing water 2 days after the earthquake linking to the SDGs. That's not a realistic way to go about it. But what, in the end, we realized was we talk about these 125 million, I think someone said 130 million, so certainly I'm working from last year's data, people in need of humanitarian assistance, and you look at how the development community works, and you look at SDGs that say no one left behind, those 125 million people are going to be left behind. We're a year into the SDG process. That's clear. Because we're not speaking to them. The SDGs do not speak to someone living in a refugee camp. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe someone here can show me how assistance in a specific refugee camp is going to get somebody within the next 15 years, to kind of meet all the SDGs. I don't see it. I don't think we're even pretending we're in that game. So,
and at least today's statistic is that 43% of people who are living in poverty live in fragile states. That number may be much larger by 2030.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's escalating. So, to reference President Robinson's comments as well as the previous two sessions' comments, there is an interlocking humanitarian, developmental, environmental, there are three interlocking crises. And where you choose to draw the lines, I don't even know. After a year as a quote-unquote expert looking at this, I don't know where to draw the lines. I don't know that if you're forced to leave your home because of conflict and you're in a refugee camp for 10 years and then you can't return because of climate change, do I call that climate displacement? What do I even call that? Or do we just at some point collapse the lines and start talking about migration, about poverty and equality and working coherently together? So I know that there's an operating environment for the humanitarian agencies. I know that there are development budgets. But the world, as I see it, I hope we collectively see it today, doesn't recognize any of those distinctions. And that's the challenge that we have to face. It's not just the UN. Our modus operandi does not map onto the reality on the ground. And I don't know, I apologize that I'm asking more questions than I'm offering solutions. But I don't know how we become more fit for purpose by saying, as Mary alluded to earlier, Syria, 4 years of drought, social, what do we even call that? What do we call a natural disaster? What do we call political unrest? It's very, very difficult. And unfortunately, if we don't address the fact that by many accounts, we're trying to grow our way out of poverty and sort of shrink our way out of emissions, which to me is going to be tough, right? There's a slight paradox there. Notwithstanding the SDGs, I mean, there's a real paradox by saying we need to produce and lift people out of poverty, but we need to shrink emissions, and somehow in the middle of all of that, we'll meet the SDGs and we'll meet 1.5. That's a really tough challenge, especially if we're still working in silos.
And we might be able to do it, maybe, as you say, it's not easy, but in the places that are stable. At least in the places where we have some sense of basic security or that are not totally ravaged by climate. But what do you do in the most challenging parts of the world?
Well, entirely. I mean, I don't know who claims to be doing a great job in Somalia other than the Somalis that are rebuilding the country themselves, which gets back to the first point. The only strategy I can see, if with humility I can offer something to this room, is investing in civil society, investing in local capacity, investing in people's abilities to fix their own problems. And when the hurricane comes, when the extremists arrive, when the commodity prices crash, that's resilience. People are resilient. Systems can be made more resilient. People are fundamentally resilient, and yet we don't invest in them. Or when we do, we give them 0.2% of the pot.
Now, people matter even at the individual level, so I have to ask you as we wrap up about your co-chair on that panel, Kristalina Georgieva, who is now one of the leading candidates to be the next UN Secretary General. What do you think it would mean for the UN system to have her, now that you know her well and know her work and her perspectives in that role?
Interesting question, Raj. I can speak to my year of working with Kristalina, and she's an extraordinary advocate for these issues. She really is. She was, as I say, probably the most expert person on our panel, or certainly on these issues. And she was someone that felt very keenly. She could reference everything back to a refugee camp she'd visited and would remind us of the truth behind the statistic. So I think having somebody of that caliber as Secretary General would be transformational, because at this moment we need, the only way we're going to meet these interlocking crises, these three challenges that I talked about, where the cost is always measured in humanitarian community, budget escalation, and lives being damaged. The only way I think we're going to resolve some of those challenges is by having a leader of the UN who is charismatic and can bring people together and remembers the human cost. And I think Kristalina could be that person. I think when we look at Paris and what was achieved, as Mary alluded to earlier, I hope it offers us some hope, having been very pessimistic. I'd like to reference what the previous panelists said. The trend lines, despite everything I've just said, are good, even though the headlines are bad. And we can look, if I can finish very briefly, a year from now, we don't know what the world's going to look like. We'll have a new US president, a new Secretary General, probably a new German Chancellor. We have new leadership in the UK. Yeah. Nobody knows what the world's going to look like. So I'm trying not to say anything definitive because, history makes fools of us all. But if we show the same commitment and the same organization that we showed around Paris, I think we can resolve some of these problems. But we have to come in this spirit of humility and collaboration, because otherwise the trend lines may start to reverse.
It's hard not to be hopeful when I see Sir Fazli Abed in the front row, and I think about all the incredible people who are here in the room, and knowing that you are now part of this community and a leader in it, it definitely leaves us, I think, on a very positive note. So I want to thank all of you for your attention, and please join me in thanking Hadeel.